Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm recording the third of a three-part series on the intersection between ayahuasca and astrology. Now, I highly recommend watching this in order because the first two parts of the series, I kind of break down things that you might want to hear first before hearing this video. In the first part of the series, I talk about what is ayahuasca, what does it do? How is it used? How long did I use and participate in ayahuasca ceremonies? For about 10 years of my life and over about 100 ceremonies. What kind of effects did it have on me practically, spiritually? In part two of the series, I talked about, how did ayahuasca end up kind of opening up the path of astrology for me? And then more specifically, how did it participate in helping me learn more about astrology? So that was part two. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the virtues and benefits of psychedelics for spiritual life or for astrology in general, as well as the potential pitfalls. Now, I promise to do this because I don't want people to think that in doing this video that there is any glorification of psychedelic culture. The reason I say that is because while I'm someone who believes that plant medicine may have a very special role to play in, mental health and in general, deeply respect its history of religious, sacred, sort of shamanic use around the world, there's a lot of problems that come up when Westerners in a more consumerist, sort of postmodern world are using ayahuasca or any kind of psychedelic. And so today I want to talk about some of the blessings and virtues of, sort of psychedelic culture in relation to spiritual life in general from my, just based on my own experience. And also, some of the benefits and potentially some of the pitfalls. Okay, so let's talk about, first of all, some of the benefits. And now I'm just speaking broadly about if you are, someone who's on a spiritual path, you're studying astrology, you're studying yoga, you're looking for a committed spiritual course of life, a direction to your life that's spiritual, and maybe a set of practices that you can take with you and so forth. And I think one of the reasons that psychedelics are so helpful is because for a lot of people, they're a gateway drug, but not necessarily to other drugs. That's actually not so true. We find that actually psychedelics are not, they're not addictive for the most part. People don't, have some, it's not like alcohol or nicotine in that sense where it's very easy for people to start demonstrating really compulsive desire to have it and be on it all the time and stuff like that. In fact, they're oftentimes very sobering experiences that people learn a lot from. And there can be a lot of psychological, personal, and even physical healing that can happen because of psychedelics. Oftentimes we know that psychedelics can be effective in treating trauma and addiction and other things. But also they're a gateway to spiritual life. They're a gateway drug to spiritual life, where psychedelics unanimously, whether you're talking about some of the great studies that have been done on LSD or some of the trauma research that's been done with, substances like ecstasy, as well as some of the studies that have been done. I have friends of mine who've been part of studies looking at the administration of psilocybin mushrooms to people who are dying of cancer as a way of helping them prepare to leave their body. So all of those cases are, that there's so many uses for them, but they tend to open people up to the idea that you are more than your body, that your body is the current home of a deeper self, a spirit soul that transmigrates, that there is an afterlife, or that there are spiritual dimensions, that there is karma, that God or divinity is real, all sorts of spiritual changes that happen in a person. And not only that, but the feeling that if one isn't living in harmony with these values and insights that come out of such experiences, that one is missing out somehow. That the feeling of, after doing psychedelics, for many people when they have a profound experience, and usually these kinds of experiences again are going to be in more sacred settings. Not to say that some people can't recreationally, sort of trip out and end up stumbling into some pretty amazing spiritual insights. I mean, I didn't get into ayahuasca myself before having other psychedelic experiences that I look back on, and I think were somewhat reckless, but they certainly opened the door for me. So these experiences are like they're openings, and people in a sacred setting seem to realize, I need to have a spiritual lifestyle. I need to be healthy. I need to take better care of my mind and body. So and there have been books, of course, that have been written more recently. I forget, I think it was Michael Pollan who wrote one recently. But yeah, I mean, obviously, people have been writing about the use and benefits of psychedelic plant medicines, again, in the right setting with the right kind of supervision, um, for a long time. And I believe that even more than just the immediate physical benefits or mental benefits, it's that psychedelics open a person to the need for spiritual communion as an everyday reality. Prayer, meditation, exercise, treating the body right, having the right kinds of community around you, the need for imagination, the need to feed the spirit, the need to get off the hamster wheel of consumerism. To a certain extent, psychedelics tend to help people with that. Does it fix it? No. But does it help? Yes. So those seem to be some of the main benefits. Some of the other benefits that I've talked about in the series already too. When I started, I accidentally, the thing that actually opened up my experience with ayahuasca was I accidentally had a psilocybin mushroom experience at a time in my life where I was basically, I would call myself like a soft addict of pain pills and, alcohol and nicotine and some other things. But that was the experience with psilocybin mushrooms was happening in the midst of a party scene in my life. And that experience stood out. I mean, it was not easy. It was beautiful. And, really, I'll tell you one story, which I told a lot before, but it always cracks me up. So my psilocybin experience I had while having a party at my apartment, and I was living in Illinois, and, basically I went into my bedroom to retreat because in particular, everyone's heads started looking just really like, I felt like, the caricature booths that you'll go like at the fair or something. And those theme park booths, so they'll draw your caricature and they make you look like kind of like a space. It's like, it's you, but it's like this kind of blown out, crazy cartoon looking version of you. Well, everyone looked like that to me, and it felt like I could see into their souls. I was just like, and I could see my own too. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, and it was so, I mean, but it was astounding. I mean, it was really impressive. So anyway, I locked myself into my bedroom, and then I started having this experience with like my cologne. I remember looking at my cologne and being like, every cologne that I had a couple, and I was like, every cologne that I have has something to do with trying to figure out who I am in contrast to my dad, because they were all choices that I made trying not to pick the smells that like he liked, it's like a simple thing. I think I was like 23 or something, or 22, but at any rate, it was revelatory though. I mean, I was like, oh my God, like, and then I looked at my wardrobe and I realized that there was like the wing of forgotten clothing, and so many of my articles of clothing, I can just still remember my astonishment at being like just touching certain shirts and being like, I know exactly why you got this shirt. I know exactly what you're trying to prove. I know exactly why you don't like wearing this one. And, there's this subtle little things that I wasn't ever even aware of. They weren't conscious to me at all. And then I ended up putting on like, I don't know, like it must have been like 20 layers of my clothing, and just like putting it on. And I was convinced that there was like an alchemy happening with my clothing. And actually there was, because after that happened, I ended up having a really meaningful purge of my clothing. And I've actually never dressed the same in my entire life since then. So yeah, I mean, but the point was that it was so deeply amazing to see the contents of my unconscious and to just like understand them. And I basically hid in my room the rest of the night, but that was a definitely like terrifying but eye-opening experience. Well, it was that experience that then led to a few more. Like I wasn't like a big, I didn't take a ton of LSD or anything like that, but I had some more recreational experiences with friends and in like kind of small and oftentimes natural settings, like out in the nature. And those experiences, I'm really lucky because some of them were very traumatizing and really scary, but some of them were also pretty amazing. And it was those experiences that led me to then wanting to sit with, once I understood very just like intuitively through these experiences, like, well, there's an actual sacred context for this. Like, I know there are such thing as, peyote traditions and mushroom traditions from Mexico, and that there are different places in the world where these sacraments, they're thought of as sacraments and so forth. So I was interested in finding a more traditional, and what felt to me like a slightly more guided experience, right? So anyway, long story short, which I told in the previous video, I ended up in the Amazon, and it ended up being psychedelics that helped me to get completely sober, find yoga, find astrology. So, you know, psychedelics, ayahuasca are they're amazing in what kind of insight they can deliver into the unconscious, seeing patterns, subtle realms, spiritual insight, the realization that we're not the body, the understanding that time is very fractal, and that time is an eternal substance. It's not just a linear start and stop. It's not just moving along a straight line. Metaphysical truths that end up leading me to astrology, seeing mandala patterns related to archetypes, a sense of being more than just a human, a sense of the divine, a sense of spirits, the indwelling divinity in all things, which led me to vegetarianism not too long after. Like just a lot of things that were really healthy revolutions in my life. At any rate, now, but there are also some pitfalls. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about those, since really in the first two videos and up till now, what I've done is really say, I have a lot of hope for how these could continue to be used, and also, genuinely would not be here without them, and especially within the guided sacred context that I found in both the Amazon and also in other settings, especially through the Santo Daime and through some other ayahuasca communities that I participated in. So what are the downsides? Well, I'm sure you can imagine some of them. I'm sure if you've listened to this series, you've already thought of some of them and maybe hoped that I would mention them, so it didn't end up seeming like a just a big psychedelic glorification session. But first of all, psychedelic, one of the things that the word means is mind manifesting, or sort of mind expanding. And so, for example, when I'm in the room and I see some of the deeper unconscious motivations behind my clothing or my cologne or whatever, that's a very common part of a psychedelic experience. And while it can be a positive thing, the negative side is that not everything that manifests in the unconscious or in our mind, which we become more aware of, is true or is real. Some of what we entertain are fantasies. And so fantasies, when they become blown up in front of us, can also lead to delusional thinking. And delusions and fantasies can actually become expanded and sort of exacerbated in heightened states of psychedelic experience. In fact, the shamans that I worked with specifically talked about a period of their training in which they had to overcome the tendency to be taken by visions, and that the training of an ayahuasquero in Peru, in isolation, often for long periods of time, eating a bland diet, dieting plants, drinking ayahuasca, learning how to be steady and centered in the midst of a mind altering experience. Part of the training is also learning how to stay in your center and recognizing, the mind, and the mind is basically an infinite wheel, just like time and the planets and everything turning and turning and turning. And we can get caught up in that. And although psychedelics can help a person to become aware of the subtle dynamics, psychedelics can also sometimes get a person even more spun out in the realm of fantasy, illusion, and the sort of the intoxicating madness of the mind, and infinite realms of the mind in the mind. And so it's not that they're not real. It's just that how those levels of mind relate to our body on planet Earth and our spirit soul contained within this body are, sometimes things aren't integrated, or there isn't an ability for some people to be able to sit and really learn that so much of what happens in ceremonies are not important or not relevant, that so many visions pass through like dreams. If you've ever been sort of lucid for a dream, that there's just it's like clouds moving. It's like if you see the clouds over a long, they do that photography where they'll speed it up and show you the clouds and the stars and everything over a long period of time. Well, dreams are like that. They're just rivers of, mental impressions of other energies and beings and realms. And but it's truly endless. And so part of what I think people sometimes miss is that psychedelic experience, for example, has been in many parts of the world associated with practitioners who are learning how to be very, very steady and grounded in order to hold space for others who are going to go through that and be spun out by it. And so there's, shamanic experience should be, an altered experience like this should be leading us to a place where we also know how to hold a center. And for some people, that mind manifesting element will lead them into making all sorts of really delusional choices, and oftentimes it can lead to like really heightened paranoia, and not just in a ceremony or in a psychedelic experience, but afterwards. And not, for a lot of people, you become sober again after a psychedelic experience, and it's like, yeah, I'm back to normal. But sometimes, like I've seen this like more times than I can count, where a person will be like, oh, I just had this really intense vision of this girl or this guy or whoever that I'm really, into, and I know that they're the one, and I'm like, oh God, here we go again. So they pursue this person because they came up in this really dramatic way during a ceremony, and it turns out that this person is absolutely not good for them. That can happen. Of course, I have seen other really amazing things happen. For example, I was in a ceremony in Peru, and I really wanted to move to New York City after graduate school. I didn't want to follow the normal path of going on to teach at a community college, and I was with someone who is from New York City, and I was just kind of sharing my angst with him. And he had a vision of a job that he could refer me to, or act as my reference for in New York City. And I ended up getting that job, and that came to him in a vision that he had while we were in ceremony. So sometimes amazing visions happen. My astrology career was born in a ceremony. So visions can be leading and guiding, but there's also this whole sea of just white noise, static, and distracting illusions and fantasies that are a part of psychedelic experience. And sometimes, if a person doesn't have a good practice of having a kind of a rational and just grounded spiritual center where they can discern and discriminate between fantasy, illusion, and truth, that people can get knocked around by psychedelic experiences quite a bit. And especially if you don't have a system or a setup in your life to help you integrate and develop those practices after a psychedelic experience, people can also deal with sometimes physiological, mental integration factors where they might have trouble sleeping for a while, or they may find that they're more sensitive than usual to different kinds of substances, and it can really start throwing a person's whole biorhythm off. It's like they don't realize, oh, I'm still drinking soda and I've become really intensely sensitive to caffeine, and they don't understand that that's what's happened. And so then there can be this weird feedback loop where a person feels like they're getting really spun out because the sensitivity goes up really quickly, bodily or mentally, and they're kind of opened up, but there's not always an awareness of how sensitive they are right away. So they're not used to being sensitive. So that can also be potentially very dangerous. Mind manifesting states in general can also heighten self-righteousness. You see things that you haven't really earned. And I don't mean, I guess maybe that's not the right way of saying it, but it's like, yeah, it is kind of, I guess. It's like, you haven't sat in meditation for years and had those subtle realms of perception opened through sustained devotional effort in sadhana, in some kind of spiritual practice. And then they're open suddenly. And so suddenly a person will start to take credit for that. I'm so great because I had this experience. A person starts, taking some credit for something that really is being provided to us by, in one sense, the grace or mercy of God, or the spirits or the plants or what have you. But on the other hand, it's not something that, like, maybe you could make an argument that karmically a person is in that situation because they're ready to be. I'm not against that. But, a warning, a red flag is when someone starts acting like, they might get like high and mighty, and they might start feeling like, oh, I'm something really special because I've had, some psychedelic insights that are profound, and they are profound. So not to take that away, but just that the potential for people to sort of get puffed up about that is there. And I've seen it again and again and again, and I've seen it in myself. When I first started drinking ayahuasca, I for probably like the first 2 years, I think my family probably thought that I was like going to become, Timothy Leary, like run around telling everyone that psychedelics will solve all of your problems or whatever. Mind manifesting experiences, any kind of psychedelic, can also heighten extremism and zealousness about anything, in general, because oftentimes a person becomes more sensitive, and again, they're not aware of that. And so it's like turning the volume up on your own thoughts, and they become a little bit more epic than they maybe are, and you don't even always notice that that's what's happening. And you can see this sometimes in the culture of people who, they have psychedelic experiences, and then it's almost as though they don't recognize that they're unconsciously perpetuating this feeling of like, now life is like a psychedelic trip, and I'm always going through all of these things, and everything is energy, and I'm like that. And so sometimes that kind of the dramatization of the, because a psychedelic experience can be kind of like the Wild West. It can be quite a ride. And so afterwards you come out of it, and so sometimes people are going around the world, and they're kind of repeating that cathartic cycle. It's like people in the Christian church when I was a kid at youth group, the same suspects, the usual suspects would be up there, every Wednesday night getting saved all over again. You know what I mean? And it wasn't because they had been so bad. It was because there was something cathartic about, like, raising your hand and like the praise and music worship is going, and like, commit their life to Jesus all over again. And seriously, God bless them, because I have had moments of that, needing that catharsis myself in lots of different ways. And it's never a bad thing to just baptize yourself all over again. But there is also this culture of like, it can be a little masochistic, where it's like, oh, I'm always going through this kind of transformative crisis. And sometimes psychedelics can actually exacerbate that. And people can perceive the world in that way too, and start projecting that onto the world, being like, oh, the world's always going through contractions and crisis and transformation. And the paradigm, the intensity of the mind changes that you're seeing, and the states of consciousness that you're seeing, shift rapidly, and the insights gained from them, and the feeling of catharsis and growth that comes from them. You start projecting that onto the world, and you don't realize that, like, a lot of the world is on autopilot. It's not tripping out right now. It's not evolving. It's not, a lot of it's very mundane. And remember, the ancient astrologers also believed that, we cycle through light and dark ages too. And that the cycle itself is endless. It has no beginning and it has no end. It's just it's like a river that's moving in a circle, time. And so there's sometimes people forget that, and they get really messianic, and they think like, the whole world needs to get saved, and like everything in the world is moving towards salvation, because psychedelics are very luciferic, or they're very Promethean, in that they deliver this just like lightning bolt of light and illumination, but they may strike down the tower in the process. And as they're doing that, people can grab onto that and sort of project it onto the world, and then be like, everything's always, moving towards some great redemptive utopian, future. And that can make a person, that can really get like trip people up in this kind of messianic thing. And if you don't believe me, like, remember that I started drinking ayahuasca and then started writing for a web magazine that was devoted to the 2012 Mayan calendar prophecies, which I don't think as ancient astrologers in general go. It's not to say that we don't move through different ages and epochs, and that prophecy doesn't play a major role. But I was involved in a culture, like, very deeply in New York City and all around the country when my book came out and so forth, that was, everyone was really involved in psychedelics and this idea of this big leap in consciousness that we're all about to take and stuff like that. And I see that now as something, not always, but sometimes it's sort of like an unhealthy byproduct of just doing too many psychedelics. So, and the reason for that, again, my understanding of why that is the case is because those states of consciousness are very cathartic, and catharsis is archetypal, meaning it's one of the eternal varieties of experiences. And so, yes, there's a way in which everything about societal and collective catharsis is true, but it's also true that there's regression. It's true that there's nothing new. We have such little tolerance for multiple ways of understanding history and being itself that are actually simultaneous to one another. And so, my experiences as I progressed, especially because in the the more that you sit with a tradition with psychedelics, the more that you're learning not to be so enamored by the sort of fireworks of the experience. And it's more about, it becomes something like, a kind of a way of learning meditation, really, to stay really centered despite the kind of constant movements of the mind and, divine, angelic messengers flying around with the world's most urgent message just for you. And you start to see those things in that space as deeper complexes of eternity that are there, but that you don't have to engage with them. It's not mandatory. And a lot of people are sort of grabbed by something, and convinced that there's something that's really, really important. And so it's almost like a paranoia, I want to call it the paranoia of meaning, that the world can become so saturated with meaning and synchronicity and meaningful coincidence and all this kind of stuff that a person has trouble letting things pass, letting things just flow along, and kind of allowing for there to be also nothing new under the sun. And so, there's sometimes people with psychedelics, they forget how to do that. They forget how to let things pass because everything is so flashy and significant, and there's not to downplay that, because what's amazing about these experiences is the way in which significance and meaning and deeper substructures and understandings of mind and reality are like experienced and seen for yourself. But it's also important to remember that, if you don't have love in your heart, you're not feeling peaceful in the moment that you're in right now. There's, what is there to find in the infinite universes aside from that? And that's a truth that psychedelic experiences, I think, kind of graduate a person to over time. And that's why so many people who stick with psychedelics for a while and develop the ability to sort of sit with them, I think, because I've noticed this over time, oftentimes people like that start taking up a daily spiritual practice of some kind that is focused on staying centered. It's a weird thing, but because there's a lot of dabbling, and there's a lot of on the dabbling side of things, that's where you tend to see popular culture really taking hold of the presentation and being like this magical thing, this amazing thing. It'll change your mind. It'll change your life. It'll heal you. It'll, and that's often the kind of consumer pop glamorized version of psychedelic experience. And again, if you, having sat with, indigenous healers in the Amazon, which maybe some of you listening to this have too, they're very, very steady people. Like the people that I sat with anyway, were just like real steady sages, right? So it's not the messianic roller coaster ride that I think in the West we tend to make it out to be. Anyway, it can definitely encourage a kind of spiritual bypassing too, where you say, yeah, I've had all these realizations and I've healed this stuff and I've cleared this stuff. And then sometimes people go back to habits, or they feel like that they're a special exception and that they don't have to put in daily spiritual practice, daily spiritual work, devoted work, not just like, slaving away at something, but really devoting your heart to spiritual life. And so I've noticed that too, that was a problem within myself. That is why I actually walked away from drinking ayahuasca. I just got the message from the medicine as I kept going that, it's time to have a daily spiritual practice. You've in a sense, it felt like I've just sort of in my journey, like you've graduated from doing this now for a while. And so like now it's time to go to the graduate school of spiritual life, where you really have to just apply what you've learned and cultivate a spiritual sadhana. And that was when yoga was really becoming more important in my life. And also I personally experienced heightened states of trauma and nervous system paranoia a little bit over time because of drinking so much. And that was a really important thing that I started realizing, that I had been drinking, over 10 years, maybe if you average it out, it's like 10 times a year for 10 years, but it was more than that, because it was more than that per year, because in the beginning I was drinking very little. And then it really, there was a big uptick later on. But by the end, I was having more disturbed mental, emotional states and nervous states. And it was becoming clear to me that this, for some people it's a path. And I'm not at all trying to make a prescription for how everyone else should handle psychedelics. But for me, it was like, if you got the message, hang up the phone. I think it was Alan Watts that said that, maybe, or Timothy Leary said that. But it felt like I had gotten the message, and that really the final and most important thing that ayahuasca had delivered to me was the same teachings of Jesus that I had grown up with, which was, what's the number one thing? Love God. That's your center. If you don't have a center around which all of the madness of the mind and the body and the ambitions and the desires that are always looping us out, if you don't have a center around which those things can find anchor, meaning, purpose, love, truth, beauty, divinity, then you're going to get lost. So you number one commandment is love God with everything you've got, and make that your daily practice. And so, and that clarified itself for me over time. It eventually led me down the path of bhakti yoga, but the need for a spiritual center rooted in God consciousness. And then the second, instruction, which was similar, was serve others in what you're doing. Try to use, this platform of astrology that you've developed to also help people come to that same God consciousness in their own hearts that you have found through these experiences to be so central, so life-giving, so important. So love others and love God. The two commandments go together. So, and that's the sort of central tenets of Sufism, of Christianity and of yoga and so forth. And they're reiterated in other traditions too. But at any rate, it came time for me to just have a daily practice. And one of the things that I noticed was that, and I don't mean to trash talk, but like a good amount of people who were hanging out continually over a long time in these communities did not have daily spiritual practices and seemed to be struggling until the next ceremony came, right? And then the next ceremony came, and it was kind of like, oh, okay, now I'm good again. And I think I noticed that it's not an addiction, but it was like a form of spiritual dependency. And, I read the Gita a lot, and in the Gita, Krishna also says very clearly to Arjuna that people who drink the soma, which is like you could say it's like an Eastern version of ayahuasca. It's an ancient entheogen. People who drink the soma, they purify themselves and they cleanse themselves and they obtain karmically to higher worlds and higher planets. But that karma eventually runs out. So, and then they fall back down. Krishna says that very exclusive, like specifically in the Bhagavad Gita, and it always just rung in my ears, and it came back in so many ceremonies. So it's interesting now that I'm a Krishna devotee, right? So now again, that's the path. That's the way that my path unfolded. And I saw many people over the years who got the same message and were like, "Thank you, this was amazing." And now I know what I got. I've got my homework, and I know what I need to go and do. I think probably more people than not experience a healthy, trip to the Amazon to drink ayahuasca like that, where, they get the message and they say, I'm going to go home and do this work now that I know I need to do. But there is this other culture that develops where it's like drinking the medicine itself becomes a kind of crutch. And I'm not against medicine. I'm not against help. I don't think machismo is the way, but, we are learning how to walk spiritually, and we have to cry out from our own heart daily and tune in from our own heart daily and recognize that we are, eternal beings that are connected to all levels of reality. And we need to midwife our own awakening too. It's very important that we not be totally dependent upon others for that, whether they're plants or people or, so forth. Even gurus in the Indian tradition are there to foster that awakening and help facilitate that awakening in the other. So, so at any rate, that I think becomes difficult for people sometimes with psychedelics, where a person will just endlessly rely on, even marijuana to a certain extent. Many people just endlessly rely on that. And again, I'm not about machismo, but just in recognizing the danger in always relying on a substance to be right. I have plenty of people in my family who have to take, antidepressants and things like that. So it's my mom's a psychiatric nurse practitioner too. So I understand that. And I was a social worker who worked with, adult schizophrenics. And, their lives would be so much worse without medicine. So I know that for some people, the level of dependency upon different kinds of medicines is going to be totally different too. But I think we need to make an effort at any rate. It's not a cure-all. Sometimes people will act as though psychedelics cure everything. They don't, and they can also be a playground for predators. There's unfortunately a history now because of ayahuasca exploding, and also there's a long history of psychedelics being misused and mishandled by charlatans, people who are power hungry, psychically manipulative, financially manipulative, materialistic. There's some sort of culture of self-indulgence that can sometimes surround it. The light that it brings in, the illumination that it brings in, a person can feel very high on that, and then develop a really stylized sense of like a theatrical stylized, I'm so enlightened, I'm so chilled, I'm so like that. And the lights can go off upstairs sometimes because a person will almost disappear into the psychedelic fog. And we want that the self is luminous on its own. It doesn't need to hide in the robes of psychedelics. It should display the soul should display its own plumage, its own peacock feathers. So you have to be careful of that, in my opinion. It can make people feel like they've made progress that they haven't. I kind of mentioned that earlier. In fact, forget which Native American tribe it is that calls marijuana the liar, because it was thought to make people think that they were doing things when they weren't. And I don't have any problem with marijuana either. I'm so glad that it's not sending people to jail, which is just so stupid. But yeah, I mean, sometimes there's a thing with any kind of psychedelic where it can make you feel like you've really gone somewhere, done something, and you haven't. Maybe you had an insight. Certainly, you can make progress too, but there's a weird way in which people can end up feeling like something is hugely important and it doesn't actually motivate them to do or change anything. It can make people think that all is one, and that I'm you and you are me and nothing is real and everything is one and stuff like that. And most ancient spiritual traditions and most shamanic traditions believe in a unity of spirit, but also in a diversity, in the agency and autonomy of the soul. So in Bhakti, God is real and the soul is real, and they aren't the same. They're like spark to the fire, same substance, same spiritual substance. So there's a sense in which unity is there, but there's also difference. And that difference is necessary for experience to be real. We need the other. So sometimes psychedelic experiences will also end up in this kind of monistic mush where people are just like, let's eye gaze because we're really exactly the same. And it's like, there can be a sense in which connecting to each other and finding that unity. I grew up literally singing Kumbaya around fires when I was a kid, right? In the church. So I'm familiar, but also, psychedelics, I think if they're not helping us to understand variegation, diversity, difference, agency, the dignity of each soul, and seeing the unity and the simultaneous separateness of things at the exact same time, they can make us lose boundaries that are important. It doesn't work well with all medications. Sometimes people are on medications and they really don't work well with psychedelics. Ayahuasca, they may have underlying health problems or behavioral issues that can come up and be really complicated. So, so it's definitely not, I wouldn't say that they're safe, which is why, again, I would say that you need to, if you're ever going to do them, don't just do it recreationally. Be in a setting where you've vetted people, that you're being really safe, and it's in a sanctioned setting, it's in a legal setting. It's not worth getting yourself into trouble over, honestly. That's just my opinion after, doing it for a while, is that, it's like, it would be really traumatic to have an amazing experience and then, be hit with some kind of really intense, awful, punitive consequences. But at any rate, it can scar people. It's very intense. Psychedelic experiences are not all good experiences. Even ayahuasca, I know people are going to be intent on saying, no, the difficult experiences are all just you purging. They're all just you going through the darkness. It's like, yeah, that can definitely be true. But unless a person comes out feeling redeemed from the experience, there are people who will just be traumatized by them. And I've seen it, so that's why I say it. It's not perfectly uplifting for every single person. So that's that's the truth. And, I'd say more often than not, if you're in a good setting with good people that are safe, the darkness will be meaningful and you'll come through it. And the degree of fear or difficulty that you may experience, and it's not all fear or difficulty, some experiences are very blissful, but those experiences, you'll probably end up feeling like, that was worth it. And I get it. But over time, if you keep doing them, there are going to be some experiences that aren't like that aren't necessarily redeeming, and that are maybe traumatizing or scarring on some level. So that's, to me, those are the dark sides, the things you have to, just kind of watch out for. Now, again, that's what I've got for this series. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it. Overall, I have real hope that these entheogens and rituals and traditions will live on. I think that they are, especially in the indigenous shamanic traditions, that they come from a divine place, and that they have a real role in a lot of the, religious, spiritual fabric of planet Earth. So, and I'm very thankful for how they played a role in my life. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this. I gotten enough questions again over the past year or two for people asking me to expand a little bit on the relationship between psychedelics or ayahuasca and astrology and my path with all of it. So I thought I'd make this video series. If you have comments, I'd love to hear them in the comment section. Please leave your stories. Again, I don't make any formal recommendations about doing anything, so please don't email me about it. I'd love to hear what you guys are up to, or just thoughts that you had going through this series. That would be really interesting. So that's what I've got, and stay tuned for more videos. If you have any you'd like to hear, any other topics that you'd like me to offer up, please email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. All right, take it easy, everyone.